right. Welcome to the Progressive Hub podcast. We have Maddy Clifford from the Debt Collective. How are you today, Maddy?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. We're excited to have you on. Been keeping up with your work and Debt Collective, and I think it's been a pretty amazing job that Debt Collective has been able to organize and get to the point of where it is now, and actually become a growing influential voice in this space. And so I know you're making TikToks and doing things to tap in. That other organizations haven't really done before. So before we get into the current status of student debt or anything, can you explain your reasoning a little bit behind the use of social media and media in general? Because I know you do podcasts and radio and all this other stuff. And so like the reasoning or the thinking behind your use of social media and as it relates to your work of debt abolition.
Sure, I love that question. I'm actually an artist and I don't always get to speak about that. I've been an artist like for 15 years now. It's probably been. And one of the ways I actually found out about the Debt Collective was 3 years ago. I was part of a project called Creative Wildfire, which was actually around the climate emergency. And during that process, we had to go to these really cool political education sessions. And in one of them, an organization out of New York, the New Economy Coalition, they basically were talking about different economic strategies for artists, because artists are so often undervalued, even though we play a pivotal role in getting the word out, right, about different issues, no matter what it is. And I found out about the Debt Collective. They were like, they're striking student loan debt. And I was thinking, striking debt? Like, you can do that? Like, I didn't
Right.
even know it was possible. And it
Right.
planted this seed in me that completely changed my life because, at the time it was 2021. So there were a lot of different issues obviously going on. There always are, right? There's so many different ways, so many ways that we can be pulled in different directions towards solidarity, towards movement making. And for me, once I started to realize debt abolition really connected a lot of things that mattered to me. And the rest is history. I was just hooked from there. And as an artist, I'm always trying to experiment. I'm always trying to build audiences, and I'm always trying to break down complicated concepts so that other people can understand.
It's so necessary, and I think that's part of why this issue has really stayed to the forefront, and people have really been continuing to press on this because it impacts people of all ages, but it's impacting millennials and Gen Z to a much larger extent. And how are you going to get the message out to them, right? I'm sure that's like a question that you all ask yourselves all the time. How are we going to get this message out? And it's so important to have people like you and the creative side on how to reach these people. Also, because like we were discussing earlier, like the bureaucracy and just the legal nature of things.
Yes.
And so one question I did have is, I know the Supreme Court ruled on debt cancellation last week, and they did not rule in the way that we wanted them to. But can you explain the current status of where just student loan debt is at the moment?
Yeah. So, first thing that people really need to understand is that the Supreme Court is extremely corrupt. They are by billionaires. They're ruling from the bench, or they're basically, using many of the justices, the conservative leaning justices, are using their power as an opportunity to push their own agendas. And so that's really important. I think some people think, oh, well, this means that Biden's student debt relief plan was not legal. That's not the case. Just like affirmative action is legal and it was also struck down. And it's not a coincidence that affirmative action and student debt cancellation were both struck down. They have a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things that are interwoven in this case, because student debt worsens already existing inequalities, especially for Black and Brown folks in this country, people who have fought in order to get onto college campuses and whose presence on college campuses has really pushed them to be leftist, has opened up new fields of study, whether it's ethnic studies or women's studies that people always call worthless degrees, and we know they're not, right? And then they're like banning books. So all that to say, it's really important that we remember that Joe Biden's student debt relief plan was legal.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but the Biden administration has, we call it a Swiss Army knife of legal options that they can use to cancel student loan debt. They already use their legal authority to cancel debt. It happens through some of the programs they have, like PSLF or the Corinthian
Right, the private
college.
colleges.
That movement has been able to cancel billions of dollars in student loan debt. So this is not something new, right? So these are the two things that we really need to remember. So the Nebraska versus Biden decision does not prevent Biden from using the Higher Education Act, and cancellation can still happen. And that's why we're pushing him. It was actually it was a positive experience to see Biden even mention the Higher Education Act of 1965, because since day one of the presidency, actually, the Debt Collective has been pushing Biden to cancel all federal student loan debt. We even wrote out an executive order that he could have just signed to make it happen. And so it's really just about continuing.
Through the Higher Education Act. That's
the Higher Education Act. But we got to stay aware of what's going on, because that doesn't mean they're not going to try to drown us in bureaucracy. That doesn't mean that Biden's not going to try to underwhelm, because let's be real, the original plan was underwhelming. I have over $120,000 in student loan debt. Up to 20K is a drop in the bucket. It's not enough, right? So we have to continue to organize.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I took out like 100,000 to go to law school. And then a few years out of law school, I was on the income-based repayment, and I wasn't paying. I was making minimum payments, but while I was making minimum payments, the interest continues to accrue, and so I gained like $20,000 in student loan debt over the course of a few years, simply because I was making minimum payments, and so it's like, yeah, this is a fucking joke, and 20,000 is the interest over the past few years. So, but Debt Collective is ready to fight, and so do you have some things or ways people can tap in? And also, yeah, we'll start with that. For ways for people to tap in, and then I also have a question about what does debt strike mean? So whichever one you want to start with.
Sure. So first and foremost, I'm really excited about this moment. It's weird because, like, on the one hand, I was kind of happy when the ruling finally went down, not because it wasn't in our favor, because that it would have definitely helped a lot of people. It would have gotten 20 million borrowers to zero and provided 400 billion in economic relief to working class Americans. And that's nothing small, right? But it wasn't enough. But at the same time, I was happy because we know now where the Supreme Court stands, and people are angry. And I think that right now is an important time for us to come together. I'm seeing a lot of people online talking about striking, talking about, I'm not paying this back. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I took out the loans, I was kind of like, I'm not paying this back, so we can both agree on that, right? Yeah. And now it's like, I want to remind folks to, instead of reinventing the wheel, to do exactly what you're doing, to find people that have been doing the work. So the Debt Collective has existed since Occupy Wall Street. This is something that has been an ongoing fight that has taken a decade in order to even get Biden to announce any type of plan. So I want to keep in mind that freedom is a constant struggle, and to remind folks about that, and to tap into our debtors union. A debtors union is really powerful because similar to what makes it different from a union of workers, is that we're organizing around our debt. We're using our debt as leverage to push for reforms and to push for full cancellation. So number one, join our union, debtcollective.org, join us. Like, being part of this union has changed my life. Like, completely. I look at things way different. Second thing, we are actually going to have a student debt update and strike training on July 13th, and there's an RSVP. Maybe you can share the link.
Yes.
And we're going to have ongoing update and strike training calls. One of the reasons that we talked about this earlier, it can get really complicated because things are constantly changing and shifting. Luckily, we have a legal strategist on board, Sparky. He's brilliant, and we are able to really break down things so that people can understand and really support borrowers to get as close to zero monthly payments as possible, or to get full cancellation. So that's like the short answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, we'll make sure to include the link
Mhm.
to Debt Collective upcoming training. But again, I see a lot of people online, and I'm one of them, and I'm saying I'm not fucking paying these loans back.
No,
I'm not doing it.
don't.
But I think we all need to understand what debt strike means, right? Like, what does it mean to be on it? And like and we're not calling for people to go into default.
Right.
So if you could explain a little bit just the different ways people can be on debt strike, and because it could come in a bunch of different forms, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So we also have another link that actually you can sign up to be part of the strike already. And we do not advocate for going to default. We see default, it's similar to like being at a protest, right? If someone gets arrested, depending on that person, the ramifications of them getting arrested is different for different people. Right.
Right.
And so uh, defaulting, I haven't personally experienced it, but people within the debt collective have experienced it, and it's excruciating. It's bad. It's like they garnish your wages, all types of things happen. But and this is really important, people are going to be forced into default because
Mm-hmm.
think about it, they're going to have to choose between paying for food, paying for rent, um, paying for housing, paying for their basic needs, or paying a student loan, right? Paying back, making a student loan payment that the federal government doesn't even need. And so that's going to actually force people into default. So we want to talk about the nuance of that, right? Because people are already have gone into default before the student debt pause. A person was going into default every 23 seconds.
Oh my
Like
god,
it
that's
was really, really bad, right? And if you know how bad default is for your credit score. And we also know 2/3 of student debtors are women. The vast majority of student debtors are Black and brown. And we know that this is going to have this huge effect on communities that are already marginalized. Right. And so that's another short answer to something that can sometimes it can be a little bit complex, but that's why at the Debt Collective, again, being part of a debtors union, we really simplify things for folks. We find out the information and then we share it with the public. And Sparky and others, we've been able to abolish billions in, and not just student loans. We actually work to abolish medical debt, carceral debt, rent debt, school lunch debt, any unjust debt that exists in this country. We're trying to abolish that, and we're trying to fight for college for all, Medicare for all, you name it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was one example of a debt strike, is right here in Los Angeles at the beginning of the pandemic. The tenants union was basically like, don't pay your rent. If you have to choose between food or paying your rent, don't pay your rent. And the state is going to have to figure it out, right?
Right.
Because the burden shouldn't be on the renters. And what happened, it went pretty became pretty popular across the city, thanks to the tenants union. And Los Angeles itself got like $5 billion in federal rent relief. It was for landlords to apply to, but that only came about because the tenants union was like, no, if we have a union of debtors, a union of rent strikers, that creates a bunch of leverage. And so, how many people in this country have student loan debt?
43 million Americans, almost 44. So one in five Americans, basically, from so many walks of life. So many walks of
Right.
life.
And so, some of us can't pay, won't pay. I don't have it. So that, like, you're not getting it either way,
Yeah.
And then there's some people that can show solidarity and figure out ways to, you know, join the debt collective, join the debt strike. And 43 million people, that we have a lot of leverage. Um, and I saw you tweeted something earlier about how the history of student loan debt came from, Ronald Reagan and his gubernatorial campaign in the 1960s in California, and how they were targeting Berkeley and the communists. And so that, again, like, the right has these long struggles of, like, and simply the Democratic Party is not fucking fit to challenge them. So we're not depending on them. Fuck them. But you see, like, the long struggle. And so Debt Collective has only been going, for a little bit over a decade, I think you said. And it'll take a path of fighting this. But, if you think about it, if this goes all the way back to Reagan, and that's the legacy of it, you think of the implications and the racial implications and all of these things. And it's great that Debt Collective is putting that kind of information out there, because I don't think people understand that not too long ago, college was free and people weren't graduating with $100,000 in student loan debt.
Exactly. And I think what really changed for me and like a light clicked was this idea that I think for so long we're taught personal responsibility rhetoric, right? We're taught that we are alone in this burden, that we should be really ashamed. Like I felt like when I was growing up or after I took on, I'm literally like my prefrontal cortex hasn't even fully developed. And I have like $100,000 in
Yeah.
debt, right? And I'm like, and everybody's like, you
Our
got a
fault.
worthless degree, right? Because I went into the arts. And I'm over here working in jails. I taught in incarcerated youth for 8 years. And I could feel how extraordinarily meaningful my work was. And yet I was getting this idea, you're personally responsible for taking on this debt. And there's something wrong with you. And you shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have done that. What I shouldn't have been born into a working class family that couldn't just pay for my debt
Right.
or pay for my student loans. Like, oh, or like I wasn't, afforded the privileges of being able to get a scholarship. I have dyslexia. I don't test well. Right. So there's all these factors that play a key role in why the crisis is where it is today. I am the educated proletariat that Reagan was worried about. You are too.
Right.
Like,
For
but
sure.
we're not paying that. We're not paying these loans back. And I actually did. I was a contributing editor in a piece called "We Owe You Nothing," which is actually a series with Prism Reports and Debt Collective. And this is a really great series to read for folks to put it into context with all the other household debts, right, that I talked about earlier, that Debt Collective also works to abolish. And we really need to move away from this idea that I'm isolated, I'm alone in this burden. You're my friend, you're my comrade. I got 43 million other comrades, right? So that in that way, we start to understand debt as being very psychological, right? You hear conservatives saying like, you signed on the dotted line, like, or they have the same 5 arguments they repeat over and over again. Or they say like, it costs taxpayers money, or that's my hardworking money. And it's like, it doesn't actually cost taxpayers money to cancel federal student loan debt.
Right.
The federal government doesn't budget like a household. And B, we're taxpayers too. Like, isn't the point of being in a society to make that society better? Our country is dealing with a huge illiteracy problem. People can't critically think. That's why they're becoming so susceptible to fascist concepts. And higher education is one of those tools we can use to really liberate a lot of people. And that's why I think there has been this effort for so long to deprive us of higher education. And so we got to fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing before we hopped on, I was looking online because I was trying to find, some analysis, because the Black Panther Party focused on education and free education. Um, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton met while in college. The Black Panther Party focused on organizing youth and college people, and that was all happening in the 60s and 70s, while COINTELPRO was targeting communists and the Black Liberation Movement. But when I was looking online, I couldn't find a whole lot of analysis between the Black Panther Party's focus on education and college to the legacy of student debt. And I don't know if you have any insider analysis on that, but I was looking for it, and I was like, that I know for a fact that is the legacy of student debt, but that story hasn't been written that I could find.
Right. I think that story, people are starting to write about it. I think it does begin with, this Reagan revolution, if you would call it, with him really starting to grab hold of California, because it was like, in California was this place where, after the civil rights movement, when we're starting to integrate these college campuses, you're starting to see again a lot of Black and brown students, a lot of students that were pushing for free speech, were pushing for, the fact of this matter is, once you get really educated, you start to expand your mind and you tend to go to the left. Like, I don't know how else to tell you. Like, that's kind of what tends to happen when
You're able to break down, you're able to see the systems that exist and see how they're functioning, right?
Right, because on the flip, the idea that fascism is about control and authoritarianism and thinking one way, and like using fear as a driving factor behind every way that you think. And so I would say like the connection there is like, well, actually, I think about Black women student debtors in particular, who hold the highest student debt burden of any other demographic. And in a lot of ways, people are like, oh, well, why are Black women, so educated? Well, it has to do with the racial wealth gap, and as well as the gender wealth gap that is like, together, it causes Black women to miss out on over $1 million over the course of our careers. And right. And so as workers, we're also supporting 80% of Black households in this country, right? And I think there's a lot of solidarity and there's a lot of connection there between Black and brown folks too, in terms of like women and women of color being really, really affected by this. And so I would say that like it's something that people should definitely continue to write about and think about, and write op-eds, write essays, talk to your friends about it, because this story, I don't think it's starting to be told, but it hasn't been told to the degree that it needs to be.
Absolutely. And Debt Collective definitely being a part of that and continuing to grow. I have a few more questions, because I think it should be clearly stated for people about the quote unquote economic impact of collecting student loans or abolishing them. They haven't been collecting student loans for the past 3 years, and the economy hasn't collapsed. And so like that argument is kind of null and void, right? Like how can you argue that people not paying student loans back is going to crush the economy when it's been happening? It's happened over the past 3 years, and why is that? Because the federal government owns the loans, and they can and money is fake, and they can do whatever they want. But maybe you have a more nuanced, detailed version than that I just gave.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's just it's actually simple. And I think once you start to like really unlock the simplicity of it, it just everything starts to unravel, because, we use the example of PPP loan forgiveness, or rather we say cancellation rather, but basically, that happens so quickly. If you think about the time frame between when they were offered and how quickly they were just like, okay, it's done. I think that might have been about $800 billion.
Right.
Right. And we know now that 80% of that money went to wealthy folks. They didn't use it to protect paychecks, right? And actually, this is actually something that people don't really know, is that when the Biden administration, the White House was kind of like outing people that got PPP loans. Remember when that was happening back in August?
Yeah.
Well, the Debt Collective was the first to do that, and they were actually kind of copying our strategy in a little bit. No shade. I'm glad they're picking up some of the things that we've been trying to get them to understand. But I think PPP loans are a really good example. The Silicon Valley bailout is another really good example of how quickly the government moves to provide relief to rich folks, to the wealthy, who have the means to pay back money oftentimes, right? And yet they work at lightning speed to make sure that those folks are taken care of. And so we need to keep that in mind, and we need to expand our imagination about, well, not even our imagination, like the federal government literally can make our lives better and should make our lives better. That's the purpose of why they're there, right? And so that's why we're constantly pushing for full automatic. Automatic's really important too, because when you create applications, when you means test things, when you drag things out in bureaucracy, you limit who is going to benefit from the relief. And like we said, just like the pause in student loan payments, you didn't have to apply for the pause. You didn't have to, it wasn't a 6-week rollout. It wasn't, it was like, there's an emergency, we're going to handle it. And I think
Donald Trump paused student loans and sent us more money than Biden. So
okay, so that part, I mean, that should just, and that's another thing we're constantly pushing Biden, because we're like, Biden, this is popular.
Right.
Like, we got to do something about the student debt crisis. This is bad for our economy. Right. And anytime, when they provided payments to people during the pandemic, it had a positive impact. Right. People talk about, oh no, student debt cancellation is going to cause inflation. So you're worried about something hypothetical when we're dealing with greedflation right now.
Right.
At this moment, we're dealing with that, right? And people just need to like really get a reality check, I think, is what it is.
I saw something the other day. It was like billionaires have like doubled their wealth or some shit. Zuckerberg gained like 60 billion in the first 6 months of 2023. Elon gained 96 billion. The world's 500 richest people added 852 billion in the first 6 months of 2023. So this is a class war, and we have to band together, because they're not going to just do it, right? That we have to continue to fight for it. And I think Joe Biden is going to make a huge mistake going into the 2024 election, turning on student loans. And if people haven't had a dime of student loans actually canceled by the election, I think he's toast. I think he's done.
Right, because we've actually experienced what it's like. I mean, we're still in debt, but like we know what it's like not to make the payment, right?
Right.
And we're like, wait, and the sky isn't falling, the government hasn't shut down. And so what it actually did was it made it clear, glaringly obvious to working class Americans that the federal government doesn't need our student debt payments. So what is the point?
Right.
Well, then you got to start asking, like, is the point control? Is the point, our debts are wealthy people's assets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And if our debts are wealthy people's assets, then we actually do have power and leverage there, and we can continue to push for that. And I think they are kind of, trying to get us to not talk about it as much, or trying to kind of sweep it under the rug. I think the bureaucracy, I don't know exactly what's going on in the minds of the White House staff, but I think the bureaucracy kind of is used to quell the movement a little bit, to kind of get us wrapped up in all the hoops that we have to jump through. Because at the end of the day, it's like, oh, they want to cancel student debt. What are they going to want next? Cancel medical debt?
Coming for it all.
And they're medical debt. That's 100 million Americans. That's a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. And I think if the power structure continues to operate as is, that there's going to be, people that are just going to be put in positions where they can't pay, and we'll see what happens, but we need to continue to organize, tap in with Debt Collective. Before we go, is there anything else that you want to plug?
Yeah, I would just say like exactly what you're saying. Like it's not just the can't pay, but it's the won't pay. I think that as I talked about when it comes to debt, debt is more psychological than it is about money all the time. The federal government doesn't need our student debt payments. So what's the point of keeping us in debt? Well, it's about control. And when we start to say, I won't pay, that is making that's a decision to stand in solidarity with one another and say, this shouldn't exist. The student loans are inherently predatory, and they worsen every economic issue imaginable in this country, and they need to be erased completely, and we need to fight for college for all. And so that's what we're fighting for at the Debt Collective, and you should definitely join us in our debtors union, debtcollective.org. We've got all kinds of amazing things going on, and you could just keep in touch with us there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Make sure to follow Debt Collective, but also make sure to follow Maddy on social media. She is great on TikTok and creating new ways to tap in and understand the issues. So make sure to follow Mad Lines on Twitter. There's a link tree with all of your stuff, and we really appreciate it. And I appreciate all that you're doing over there, and let's cancel student debt.
Let's do this. Thank you.